I haven't seen any of the footage, but I've been asked by people that I know and people who live near me, including friends and family, what I think about the January Washington, D.C. riots. Personally, I think that anyone who went to that riot was just wasting their time. But there's a bigger issue here, and one of principle. Whether or not the way in which we respond to things in our government and our nation with which we happen to disagree says a lot about us and our individual character, and the manner in which we attempt to seek redress, no matter what choice we make, tells a lot of people about us. And the chicanery and nincompoopery we've seen on display from people in the Capitol gives us all reason to reflect and consider, when things go our way, how do we respond? It's been a long time because we've all been locked down, but I used to from time to time dress women, usually in the grocery store, who were not responding correctly to their tantrums thrown by their children. It's very common, or at least it used to be, to see children demanding things last minute in the checkout aisle and then throwing a tantrum if they didn't get their way. And it has long been my contention that it is no mark of maturity to say, give me what I want or I will be a miscreant. All last year in 2020 and the beginning of this year, we have seen a lot of miscreant behavior. And it begs the question of, who are the miscreants? How do we deal with them? And what should we do when things don't happen according to our way? The problem with this, of course, is that riots, outbreaks, and rebellions are all matters of emotion. And emotional behavior is usually not logical and very difficult to combat. Emotion results when outcomes differ from expectations. And so it's very common in human behavior that emotions govern our behaviors. In this video, I'm going to address the 3 points: my feelings on those engaged in riots and rioting throughout the last 12 months. Number 2, the identity of those engaged in the rioting and the riots. And number 3, the response we have seen to the rioting and the riots. So number 1, my response to the fact that riots and rioting actually occurred. I think that all of these riots are absolutely abhorrent, and that the individuals who have participated in them, regardless of whether or not they claim to be peacefully protesting, when property damage or physical harm is caused, deserve whatever repercussions the law deems appropriate. Sedition and rebellion are unbecoming of a civilized people and a people protected by the Constitution and its powers that we enjoy in this country. So everyone who rioted, no matter where the riot occurred, everyone who penetrated property that doesn't belong to them, no matter where that was, anyone who harmed another person or stole another person's property has committed criminal acts against not only their neighbors, but against our constitutional law and the republic for which our flag stands. This is not a threat to our democracy. We're not a democracy. We are a republic. The Constitution, however, we know full well from those who helped to author it, cannot govern those who refuse to be governed by their own consciences or by the laws passed by a civil society. One of the writers of the Constitution once said that the Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And what we have seen are immoral and irreligious people engaged in selfish acts of envy and enmity that have allowed them an opportunity to exercise their hatred against those with whom they disagree. There is a way to seek redress, and this is not it. Because we still have the vote, whether you believe the election was legitimate or not, there are opportunities in a year, 2 years, and 4 years to exercise our voice and elect new leaders if we like. There are also ways in which we can contact our representatives as currently extant, appeal to the courts, appeal to public opinion, and rioting and looting and burning things down just makes most civilized people upset. So if you're engaged in that, you are engaged in uncivil behavior, and you deserve whatever comes your way. Point number 2, who were the rioters and the looters? Now, depending on which one you look at, and depending on what news organizations you look at, you'll of course get different stories. My point is at no point in any of these riots was there a concerted effort to actually investigate the identity of the attendees. When we're talking about the Black Lives Matter protests that occurred early last year and into the late summer and early fall prior to the election, or we're talking about this January's Capitol Hill riot, there have been people who have jumped to conclusions and made assumptions about the identities, or they have blithely disregarded allegations that the attendees belonged to a particular group. I have not seen evidence, let alone proof, of who these people actually were. I've also never seen proof or evidence about who actually incited the riots, with some exceptions. I have seen video of prominent Democrat politicians who, during the BLM protests, encouraged the protesters to burn it down and to continue to protest until they got what they wanted. In particular, 2 names come to mind, Maxine Waters and Kamala Harris, or Camelot Harris, as I'm going to start calling her. These 2 individuals have called for that, which is grossly repugnant in my mind, given the fact that Kamala Harris was once the top cop in the state of California. I have also seen video where President Trump condemned those currently rioting and looting in the Capitol. There's a lot of stupid people out there doing stupid things, but that doesn't mean that everyone at the riot shares a particular political ideology. I know that they sell merchandise to whomever buys it. So whether you believe in a particular candidate or not, you can go to their website and buy their stuff. And that just because they're wearing particular hats, pins, shirts, whatever, doesn't mean they subscribe to that. This has always been true. In war, there is always subterfuge and people who wear the enemy's colors or no colors at all in order to obfuscate their actual identity. It is, however, interesting that if you think about the January riots, that the individuals who are responsible for some of the most egregious behaviors, i.e. the stealing of the podium and the gavel, were individuals who didn't try to mask their identity at all. If you think back to the founding days of this nation, the individuals who threw tea in the harbor all dressed up so that they could not be recognized. So think about that for a moment. Not everyone who comes to a riot is there for the actual reason that the riot is assumed to exist. For example, I live in Vegas, and if the Vegas Golden Knights had won the Stanley Cup in their inaugural season, this city would have been torched. Maybe not so much, because our cops are sort of intolerant of shenanigans because we are a tourist economy. But there would have been people who rioted and tried to loot and tried to at least create a kerfuffle. And not everyone who was here would have cared about the Golden Knights at all. Some of the people engaged in the riot would have been there for the rioting, the looting, and the debauchery. They would have had no interest in or connection to the Knights, but would have simply taken advantage of the opportunity to loot and burn. You will see this in hockey contests. You'll see this after the Super Bowl, where there's always a riot. And it isn't necessarily that everyone there was involved in the riot or that everyone who believes in it attended the riot. So to presume that the identity of all the rioters is known is foolish, foolhardy, and asinine. Finally, we must consider the way in which the riots were treated. There was an incongruous treatment of the rioters. Individuals earlier last year were all referred to as peaceful protesters, even while we watched things burning behind them in the background. And of course, it is assumed that all of the people in the Capitol, and there is reason to believe that this is fitting, are definitely not peaceful at all. But there were the same kinds of behaviors that we saw in January this year are similar to things we saw all last year, and yet we did not hear the same kind of condemnation from the media towards those who were rioting. because of what they were rioting about. It's almost like there's a different standard of virtue depending on the topic of the riot, or that the difference between a peaceful protest and a riot depends on whether or not your political ideology agrees with the media and the left. As I mentioned before, there were Democrats who specifically told their supporters to riot. Democrats demanded that the police lose funding. Donald Trump condemned the riots. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people who work for him who identify as his supporters who were claiming to do so, but there have always been traitors, there have always been turncoats, and there have always been people who are of two minds or secretly of the opposite one entirely. For example, years ago, and I can't remember what year this happened, Rush Limbaugh called for Operation Chaos and asked for Republicans to register as Democrats in order to mess up the Democrat political primary. Now, of course, no one was physically hurt by this and no property was damaged, but if you were to presume that just because someone is registered as a Democrat that they're going to vote that way, or that just because someone is wearing a MAGA hat that they agree with and voted for Donald Trump, then you have assumed, and we all know what assuming does and means. The media, however, is only outraged when Trump's people do it. They find excuses for those who riot who agree with them, and then find a reason to cast blame and aspersions at those they don't like. This is a very natural human behavior. It is normal to lionize those who agree with you and paint those who disagree with you in caricature. This is, however, not elevated, educated, intelligent, or civil behavior to assume that because that you get along lock, stock, and barrel, forgive the reference, with those who say they support you. I share both religious and political identification with certain members of Congress, but that is where our affiliation ends. It's clear by their ideology, their actions, their votes, and their speeches that our agreement ends when the identifier ends, that our religious affiliation is terminated at the door, and that our politics diverge at the ballot box. Everyone who riots is a criminal. Looting, burning, and assaulting people are uncivilized behaviors and should be punished with full force of law regardless of your political affiliation. We are all God's children. We're all part of the family of man. We're all members of the same nation. And when we poke each other in the eye, we forget sometimes we're poking ourselves in the eye as well. And while the media may strain at gnats when it comes to Republicans and swallow camels when it comes to Democrats, it is incumbent upon all civil people to resist the notion to burn Rome if Rome does things with which we disagree. After all, we live here, and the evils that are perpetuated when riots and looting occur eventually are things that cost us as well. And they may not cost us immediately or obviously, but an eye for an eye does make the whole world blind, and cutting off your nose to spite your face is a really stupid way to make yourself look better. The behavior exhibited by many Americans over the last 12 months has made us fit scorn for the mockery of others in foreign nations who are watching the greatest country on earth devolve into incivility, ruin, and political unrest. At the end of the day, we are still neighbors, we are still co-workers, we are still family members, and we are still citizens of the same nation. And if we drag each other down, we cannot advance as a nation, as a people, and as neighbors. The only way to actually affect change is to invite others to consider the fact that they might be wrong, to give them information to show why we believe what we believe, and then to wait patiently and see if they reform themselves. Sedition and rebellion are unbecoming of everyone according to my religious dogma, because they are activities in which the adversary of righteousness has been engaged since time immemorial, when it was his initial plan to force everyone to do what was right. And the philosophy of hell is not a philosophy that breeds happiness, peace, and brotherhood. It is one that can only bring sameness and misery side by side in hell. There is no virtue in applying the adversary's methods to achieve the Father's plan, and going out there and engaging in what we sometimes refer to at church as wonderful contentions with one another does not convince other people that we are right. I've never seen a man who was beaten up by someone with whom he disagreed, who, after being lifted from the ground, said, "You know what? After that pummeling, I can see you are totally correct." I have been yelled at by people who have used vulgar language, and that has never made me want to take their side, see their view, or agree with their perspective. An eye for an eye just creates more bloodshed. So I call upon individuals, regardless of your political stripes, if you are willing to do so, to re-examine your behavior and do the things and become the things that are necessary for a civil society and a republic to endure. I know this means that sometimes you will have to sit on your hands, and sometimes you will sit and wish that there was something to do. One day, some group may have to become the forlorn hope, but it is not today. All other avenues of attempt to address wrongs have not been exhausted, and if you are damaging the property of, or taking the lives of innocent people, or costing strangers who have nothing to do with it, then you are not the solution. You are the precipitate. And the precipitate has no effect on the solution. As a biochemist, I am interested in and paid to find solutions. I know that's sort of a pun and a double entendre, but it is our job as scientists to ask the right questions and analyze the value of the answers that we receive. The questions are not being asked, so the answers are not being provided, but the activities in which people have engaged over the past 12 months in the United States will cause a response and an answer from the government that may cause more trouble than our silence might have as well. To everything there is a season and a purpose under heaven. There is a time to speak up. There is also a time to wait. We have no idea what the future will bring. We have no idea what actually will happen this week after the Biden administration takes control of the country. Do not let fear of what might happen keep us from finding out what will. The word Israel means let God prevail. He will, in his way, in his time. And it is time for Israel to be our rallying cry, to trust in him, his grace, his wisdom, his timing, and his assistance. If the time for action comes, he will tell us what is truly good and right for us to do. And I guarantee you that the very last thing he will ever ask is for us to hurt our fellow men, especially intentionally. May we come to a greater realization of the fact that hurting each other ultimately hurts us as well, and find other ways to deal with our problems that do not require the laying on of hands. Until all other lights go out, there is no need to resort to violence, and it won't solve anything. In fact, it might make things worse. Do not commit the crime for which you feel you now serve the sentence. Godspeed, and may God prevail. Good night.